Did Yahweh condone child sacrifices? In today's video, I'll attempt to answer that question by looking at the stories of Jephthah, Isaac, and others. We'll start by taking a look at a clip from Satan's Guide to the Bible, and then analyze Mike Winger's response to it. You can find links to all the videos used for today's clips in the description below. Let's take a look at the first clip.
My God is not cool with killing innocent children for divine favors in battle.
That may be, but the God of the Bible is.
Victory in battle is related in an integral way to your offering these things to the deity.
In the 11th chapter of the book of Judges, Jephthah, the leader of the Israelites who are at war with the Ammonites,
More-ites?
from Canaan, wanting to secure victory for the Israelites, Jephthah makes a promise to God.
If you give the Ammonites into my hands, whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return in triumph from the Ammonites will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering.
The leader of the Israelites promises God he will set fire to whoever greets him first when he returns home from battle.
He will devote to the Lord first thing he sees. But of course, it turns out to be his daughter, his only child. And
I'm back, and I won! Who's behind door number 1?
Welcome home, Daddy!
Satan's Guide to the Bible implies that the God of the Bible is okay with killing innocent children for divine favors in battle. But I think the unspoken question here is, why didn't God stop it from happening? Which leads to the even bigger question of the problem of evil, and why an all-loving, all-powerful, and all-knowing God allows those types of things to happen. But Winger doesn't pick up on any of that, because the presentation of Satan's Guide to the Bible is South Park-like, being punchy and flippant, and he understandably only addresses the surface-level claim. Let's take a look at Winger's response.
They present it as though God is cool, quote, cool with killing innocent children for divine favors in battle. Quoting from the propaganda here. Is that true? The God of the Bible is cool with that. No, because Jephthah blew it. That's the thing. They show no text in Scripture anywhere that suggests that God was favorable towards this, wanted Jephthah to do this, that it was okay in any way. Let me give you guys a number of reasons for this, because I know there's probably people watching right now who just think I'm the one offering propaganda, and that's fine. I want you to think this through. Here's some evidence, okay? There shall not be found among you anyone who burns his son or daughter as an offering, anyone who practices divination or tells fortunes or interprets omens, and then goes on and on and on. That's Deuteronomy 8:10.
Winger then goes on to quote similar verses in Exodus 13:13, Jeremiah 7:31, and Ezekiel 16:20, which all make similar points. And I think Winger is obviously right that parts of the Bible do forbid child sacrifice. But ultimately, he is wrong about the issue as a whole. The irony here is that Winger calls Satan's Guide to the Bible propaganda, but then responds by quoting from some of the best propaganda ever written, and takes the Bible at face value. I'll explain why he's wrong in a bit, but first, I want to talk about what the typical response would be to Winger. The typical response is that, sure, the Bible contains commands against child sacrifice to Yahweh, but the reason those commands are there is because there was, at one time, child sacrifices made to Yahweh. And to his credit, Winger does kind of mention that, but then essentially says it's beyond the scope of his video. The following clip is of biblical scholar Heath Durrell, summarizing the view of German theologian Otto Eisfeld.
They're excavating Carthage where these Punic colonists are living, and they're finding inscriptions. And the inscriptions seem to be talking about child sacrifice. And they call the sacrifice a molk. It's a molk sacrifice. It's the name of a sacrifice. And at the time, Eisfeld only had a handful of these inscriptions. Since then, we have quite a few more. And Eisfeld said, wait a second, molk, child sacrifice. In the Hebrew Bible, we also have molk. Another one of the things the preposition la in Hebrew can do is to mean as. So if you sacrifice a cow, you can sacrifice it la olah, as a burnt offering, a whole offering, Holocaust. And he said we shouldn't be reading this, that children are passed over by fire la to a god Molech, but la as a Molech sacrifice. He went further and said, well, if they're sacrificing them as Molech sacrifices, then, okay, who's the god that's getting them? And Eisfeld said, well, as far as we can tell, by far the most popular deity in ancient Israel was Yahweh. These sacrifices are said to have taken place in the Hinnom Valley, which would have been in not quite spitting distance, but definitely eye shot of the Jerusalem temple, where Yahweh's shrine was. So Eisfeld said, no, they're not sacrificed to a god Molech, but they were being sacrificed as Molech offerings to Yahweh. To be clear, the Hebrew Bible makes abundantly clear, maybe with minor exceptions, but even then it's controversial. These are not good. It never says that in the Hebrew Bible that you ought to be making these offerings to Yahweh. But it does say several different times that you're not supposed to. And you don't make laws against things that people aren't doing. And you don't say you should stop doing something if people aren't doing it.
Durrell/Eisfeld is partially right on this. But again, they're ultimately wrong because they, like Winger, are still taking too much of the Bible at face value. So then, how do we figure out if child sacrifices were made to Yahweh? We need to reconstruct what the narratives were before the biblical authors changed them. We can do this by doing a reconstructive reading of the biblical text. You can learn the details of how I do this by reading my methodology on my website. But in a nutshell, propaganda gives signals as to where it is trying to change the narrative, and we can use those signals to reverse engineer the original narrative. And although there are a number of signals we could use to do that, I'll be focusing on just one signal in today's video, primarily for the sake of brevity and because it's one of the most reliable signals that I've dealt with. And that signal is emphasis. In other words, if we see an unusual amount of emphasis in the biblical text, this is usually a signal that the biblical author was trying to change the narrative on that point. To understand whether or not children were sacrificed to Yahweh, we need to question some basic assumptions. One of those assumptions is that Yahweh was the God of Israel. Why are we repeatedly told explicitly that Yahweh is the God of Israel in the biblical text? Why are we repeatedly told that the Israelites are his people? Durrell's logic applies here. If human sacrifices to Yahweh were occurring, then there wouldn't be a need for a ban. Similarly, the emphasis on Yahweh being the God of Israel would be unnecessary if this were already universally accepted. And it's the same with the Temple of Jerusalem. It's repeatedly emphasized that the temple was Yahweh's temple, indicating that it was not originally Yahweh's temple. You can watch my video, The Dirty Secret of Solomon's Temple, to learn more details. So then, biblical authors injected Yahweh into Israel's history so that he could be the God of Israel. However, this created a problem because there was child sacrifice in Israel's history. This problem is solved in various ways. Let's take a look at the following verses. Some of them are the same verses that Winger quotes. One strategy was to blame child sacrifices on other gods. Jeremiah 19:5 says that their sons were offered as burnt offerings to Baal, not Yahweh. The last part of that verse is part of another strategy, and that was just to deny it. Another example is in Jeremiah 7:31, where it says that Yahweh did not command child sacrifice. Furthermore, biblical authors say that Yahweh explicitly commanded them not to offer child sacrifices. Deuteronomy 18:10 says, "There shall not be found among you anyone who makes his son or daughter pass through the fire." Another example is Exodus 13:13, which says that you should redeem your firstborn sons, not sacrifice them. This provides a plausible misunderstanding for the original reader. Oh, you thought Yahweh allowed child sacrifices? No. They were supposed to redeem them. However, the laws forbidding child sacrifices prompted a question. If Yahweh didn't provide the laws allowing the sacrifice of children, then who did? This once again presents a problem since the biblical authors didn't want to admit there were other laws by other gods in Israel. Ezekiel 20:25-26 may have been an attempt to answer that question. It says, "I also gave them statutes that were not good, and ordinances by which they could not live. And I pronounced them unclean because of their gifts, and that they made all their firstborn pass through the fire, so that I might make them desolate, in order that they might know that I am Yahweh." Furthermore, there was another problem that biblical authors had to deal with. The biblical authors took narratives about other gods in Israel and made them about Yahweh. You can watch my video, Multiple Elohist, to learn how and why that was done. The problems arose because sometimes the people in those narratives made child sacrifices. So if those people worshiped Yahweh, how do you explain those sacrifices? The biblical authors came up with some creative solutions. We can turn to Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac to see an example of this. In that passage, we read that, sure, Yahweh commanded Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, but at the last second, Yahweh stops it from happening and reveals it was just a test. This is an excellent way of taking a story about a child sacrifice and changing it into a plausible misunderstanding for the original reader. Oh, you thought Abraham sacrificed Isaac? No. Yahweh stopped him at the last second. This raises the question, though. If Isaac died in the original narrative, how could Jacob be his son? The land was Abraham's according to oral tradition, and the biblical author needed a way to splice Jacob into Abraham's family line that wasn't related to Ishmael. Isaac served that purpose. With all that in mind, let's turn back to the story of Jephthah and his daughter, which offers another example of how a biblical author changed the narrative. In the oral tradition, Jephthah made a sacrifice to a god who wasn't Yahweh. The biblical author changes this to Yahweh, but says that it wasn't because of Yahweh's command, rather, it was because of Jephthah's foolish vow to Yahweh. In both the Isaac and Jephthah's biblical narratives, we bristle at the action or inaction of God. But for the biblical authors, their agendas were of primary importance. And in these cases, changing the narrative about child sacrifice was the agenda, regardless of how readers feel when they read it today. If we can reconstruct the oral traditions, we can also get a glimpse as to why child sacrifices were made. On the face of it, we assume that they were made in order to receive a blessing from the God to which they were sacrificed. But if we dig deeper, there appears to be a different reason. Let's turn back to the sacrifice of Isaac. That account is littered with references of Abraham and Isaac as father and son. This implies that Isaac was not Abraham's son in the oral tradition. That, of course, raises the question, whose son was he? If he wasn't Abraham's son, we would expect the biblical author to explain away the real father, and that's just what we find with Abimelech. The biblical narrative is sure to tell us that even though he took Sarah, he did not have sex with her, and that all of the wombs in his household had been closed while Sarah was with him. This implies that Abimelech was Isaac's father in the oral tradition, and this is what triggered Abraham's desire to sacrifice Isaac. With this in mind, child sacrifice takes on a new purpose. It was a way for those in power to get rid of illegitimate children. Kings especially would have been motivated to eliminate illegitimate children, both to protect their lineage and their reputations, not to mention their egos. For 2 examples of how biblical authors changed the narrative about illegitimate children, check out my blog post about how Uriah had an affair with Bathsheba before the biblical author changed it to David, and my video about how Jonathan was David's son before the biblical author changed his father to Saul. Now when we read Ahaz and Manasseh, and even the king of Edom, sacrificing their sons, it allows for the possibility that there was another story behind the scenes. Perhaps he discovered their sons were illegitimate and used child sacrifice to dispose of them. Turning back once again to the story of Jephthah, we see that the father-daughter relationship is emphasized, indicating that Jephthah's daughter was not actually his daughter in the oral tradition. Once again, it appears that Jephthah is another example of someone who used child sacrifice as a way to get rid of his illegitimate child. So to recap, did the Israelites offer child sacrifices? Yes, because we can see how the biblical authors were trying to change the narrative on that point. Why did the Israelites offer child sacrifices? At least some offered them to dispose of illegitimate children without having to admit publicly that they were illegitimate. And finally, did Israelites offer child sacrifices to Yahweh? Probably not, because Yahweh wasn't the God of Israel during that time. That's it for today. Thanks for watching, and please like, share, and subscribe.